For most of us, spices are nothing more than a quick stop in the supermarket. A small jar of black pepper costs less than a cup of coffee. Cinnamon sweetens desserts. Nutmeg quietly waits in the back of a kitchen cabinet, while cloves appear only during the holidays. They seem ordinary, almost forgettable. But there was a time when these tiny ingredients were among the most valuable commodities on Earth. Men crossed unknown oceans searching for them. Powerful kingdoms gambled their fortunes to control them. Thousands of sailors vanished at sea, entire islands were conquered, and countless lives were destroyed in the pursuit of flavors that could fit inside the palm of a hand. The quest for spices helped launch the age of exploration, fueled European colonial empires, and gave birth to some of the world's first multinational corporations. This is not just the history of food. It is the story of greed, power, conquest, and how a handful of spices quietly changed the course of human civilization forever. Before Europeans ever dreamed of reaching Asia by sea, spices had already traveled across continents for thousands of years. Black pepper flourished along the humid Malabar coast of India. Cinnamon was harvested in the forests of Sri Lanka. Cloves and nutmeg grew naturally on only a handful of tiny volcanic islands in what is now eastern Indonesia, a place so remote that few people outside the region even knew it existed. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, Chinese, Indian, Arab, and Persian merchants had built sophisticated trading networks that linked these distant producers with markets across Asia, the Middle East, and East Africa. Cargoes moved from one merchant to another, crossing tropical seas, winding rivers, and vast deserts, before finally reaching Mediterranean ports. Every stop along the journey increased the price. By the time these spices arrived in Europe, they had become incredibly rare, astonishingly expensive, and surrounded by an aura of mystery that made them even more desirable than the precious goods themselves. The strange part is that spices were not valuable simply because they made food taste better. For centuries, many people repeated the myth that medieval Europeans used spices to hide the taste of rotten meat. But that explanation does not really hold up. Rotten meat could still make people sick, no matter how much pepper or cinnamon covered it. The real value of spices came from something deeper: rarity, status, medicine, and imagination. Pepper showed wealth at the dinner table. Cinnamon carried an almost royal elegance. Cloves appeared in perfumes, remedies, and religious rituals. Nutmeg was believed by some Europeans to protect against disease, even when those beliefs were exaggerated or wrong. To own spices was to own something distant, exotic, and difficult to obtain. They were not everyday seasonings. They were symbols of power. A noble household did not just eat spices, it displayed them. If spices were so valuable, one question naturally followed: where did they actually come from? For centuries, most Europeans had no clear answer. They knew the goods arrived through bustling markets in cities such as Alexandria and Venice. But the true origins of pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg remained hidden behind a vast network of merchants, stretching across Asia and the Middle East. Arab, Persian, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants controlled different sections of the vast trading network, while Venetian merchants dominated much of the spice trade entering Europe through the Mediterranean. Every caravan that crossed a desert and every ship that sailed another sea added another layer of cost. By the time a sack of pepper reached a European buyer, its price had multiplied many times over. This chain of middlemen made spices extraordinarily profitable, but it also frustrated Europe's rising kingdoms. If they could bypass the existing trade routes and sail directly to the source, the rewards would be almost unimaginable. That dream of reaching the source of the spice trade helped ignite one of the greatest turning points in history. During the 15th century, European kingdoms poured money into ships, navigation, and exploration, convinced that a direct sea route to Asia would unlock unimaginable wealth. Portugal led the race, sending expedition after expedition farther down the western coast of Africa. Backed by the vision of Prince Henry the Navigator and generations of skilled sailors, Portuguese navigators steadily pushed beyond waters that many Europeans once feared to enter. Their goal was never simply adventure, it was profit. Every mile sailed offered the possibility of breaking the monopoly held by Arab and Venetian merchants. Then, in 1498, everything changed. After rounding the Cape of Good Hope, Vasco da Gama reached the west coast of India, opening a direct maritime route between Europe and the Indian Ocean. For Portugal, it was more than a geographic breakthrough. It was the beginning of a global empire built on spices. But Portugal was not the only kingdom chasing the smell of cloves, cinnamon, and pepper across the horizon. Spain wanted its own path to Asia, and that ambition helped send Christopher Columbus west across the Atlantic in 1492. Columbus did not set out to discover a new continent. He believed he could reach Asia by sailing in the opposite direction, cutting around the long and dangerous routes controlled by rival powers. What he wanted was access to the same treasure that had obsessed Europe for generations: spices. When he reached the Caribbean, he thought he had arrived near the islands of Asia, and he searched eagerly for pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and other valuable goods. Instead, he had stumbled into an entirely different world. Yet even that accident carried the shadow of the spice trade. One of history's most famous voyages began not with a search for a new world, but with the hunger for flavor, wealth, and control. With a direct route to the Indian Ocean finally secured, Portugal moved quickly to turn exploration into domination. Rather than conquering vast inland territories, the Portuguese focused on controlling the key ports through which the spice trade flowed. Under leaders such as Afonso de Albuquerque, they captured strategic cities, including Goa in India and Malacca in present-day Malaysia, giving them influence over some of the busiest trade routes in the world. They also established a network of fortified trading posts, stretching from East Africa to Southeast Asia, and introduced the cartaz system, requiring merchant ships to purchase Portuguese permits before sailing through waters they claimed to control. Those who refused risked having their cargo seized or their ships destroyed. Before long, heavily loaded Portuguese carracks were returning to Lisbon with pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg worth fortunes. The profits transformed Portugal into one of Europe's wealthiest maritime powers, and proved that spices could build an empire as effectively as armies. Portugal's success did not remain uncontested for long. By the end of the 16th century, the Dutch Republic had emerged as a powerful maritime rival, determined to seize control of the trade that had made Lisbon rich. Dutch merchants sent expeditions into the Indian Ocean, mapping routes, studying Portuguese defenses, and searching for direct access to the islands where cloves and nutmeg grew. Then, in 1602, several competing Dutch trading companies were merged into the Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC. It was unlike an ordinary business. The Dutch government gave it the authority to build forts, raise armies, wage war, sign treaties, govern colonies, and punish resistance. Investors purchased shares and expected profits from voyages conducted thousands of miles away. On a scale rarely seen before, private capital, military power, and colonial ambition were fused into a single global enterprise. The spice trade was no longer merely commerce. It had become corporate conquest. At the center of this growing conflict lay a tiny group of volcanic islands in eastern Indonesia, the Banda Islands. They were remote, fertile, and almost invisible on European maps. Yet they possessed something found naturally nowhere else on Earth: nutmeg and mace. This made the islands astonishingly valuable. A small shipment purchased cheaply in Banda could be sold in Europe for many times its original price, turning a successful voyage into a fortune. But the Bandanese were not isolated or inexperienced traders. For generations, they had exchanged spices with merchants from Java, India, China, and the Arab world, negotiating with several buyers rather than submitting to a single foreign power. The Dutch, however, did not want fair competition. They wanted total control. They demanded exclusive agreements that would prevent the islanders from selling nutmeg to anyone else. For the people of Banda, accepting such terms meant surrendering their independence, their economy, and the harvest that had sustained them for centuries. The Bandanese resisted, and the Dutch response was brutal. In 1621, Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Cohen led a military campaign to crush opposition and secure a complete nutmeg monopoly. Dutch forces invaded the islands, destroyed villages, executed local leaders, and forced thousands of people from their homes. Many were killed, deported, or sold into slavery. Others fled to neighboring islands, leaving communities that had existed for generations nearly erased. After the conquest, the Dutch divided the most productive land into plantations known as perken, which were managed by European settlers and worked largely by enslaved laborers brought from elsewhere in Asia. Nutmeg continued to grow, and ships continued to carry it toward Europe. But the people who had once controlled the trade had lost almost everything. This was the darkest truth behind the spice boom. An ingredient that flavored European tables had become the justification for massacre, forced labor, and the destruction of an entire island society. The conquest of Banda revealed what the Dutch East India Company had truly become. It was no longer simply a group of merchants buying and selling goods. Across Asia, the VOC built forts, controlled harbors, collected taxes, enforced monopolies, and maintained private armies powerful enough to challenge local rulers. Company officials negotiated treaties as if they represented a sovereign nation, while warships protected commercial routes and punished competitors. In Amsterdam, investors received dividends from profits generated thousands of miles away, often without seeing the violence that made those profits possible. This structure helped shape the modern corporation. Shareholders provided capital, managers directed distant operations, and risk was spread across large numbers of investors. But the rewards were never shared equally. European shareholders accumulated fortunes, while farmers, sailors, enslaved laborers, and conquered communities absorbed the danger. The VOC showed the world that a company could become an empire, and that profit, when backed by military force, could be as destructive as any king. England had no intention of allowing the Dutch to control the spice trade alone. The English East India Company, founded in 1600, entered the same waters with ships, soldiers, and investors hungry for profit. English merchants competed for access to pepper in India and cloves and nutmeg in Southeast Asia, while Dutch officials tried to drive them from the most valuable ports and islands. Commercial rivalry quickly became military confrontation. Ships were captured, trading posts attacked, and local rulers pressured to support one European power against another. The struggle was no longer simply about buying spices. It had become a contest over sea routes, territory, and political influence. Europe's empires were learning that control of trade could be just as important as control of land. And in the islands of Southeast Asia, communities that had traded freely for centuries found themselves trapped between foreign companies willing to use cannon fire to settle business disputes. The struggle produced one of the strangest territorial settlements in history. The English had established a claim to Run, a tiny island in the Banda Group that could produce enormous quantities of valuable nutmeg. Meanwhile, English forces had seized the Dutch colony of New Netherland in North America, including New Amsterdam on Manhattan. When the Second Anglo-Dutch War ended with the Treaty of Breda in 1667, both sides largely kept the territories they controlled. England retained New Netherland, which soon became New York, while the Dutch secured Run and strengthened their grip on the nutmeg trade. It was not a simple island-for-island exchange, but history remembers it that way for good reason. At the time, Manhattan was a distant colonial settlement. Run represented immediate profit and the final piece of a global monopoly. The Dutch believed they had protected the greater prize. Centuries later, the comparison would appear almost unimaginable. But no monopoly could remain unbroken forever. The Dutch guarded their spice empire fiercely, restricting cultivation and destroying trees outside approved plantations to keep supplies limited and prices high. Yet the plants themselves became targets of espionage. During the 18th century, the French horticulturist Pierre Poivre organized efforts to obtain nutmeg and clove seedlings from territories controlled by the Dutch. After repeated failures, the stolen plants were successfully established on French-controlled islands in the Indian Ocean, especially Mauritius. From there, spice cultivation began spreading beyond the islands, where the Dutch had tried to contain it. Other colonial powers followed, transplanting nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon into new tropical territories. Slowly, geography stopped protecting the monopoly. Spices that had once grown in only a few closely guarded locations could now be cultivated across several regions. The trees survived the journey, but Dutch control did not. And once the secret of cultivation escaped, the entire economics of the spice trade began to change. But the collapse of the Dutch monopoly did not end the exploitation behind the spice trade. As cultivation spread across colonial territories, European powers created new plantations that depended on cheap, controlled, and often coerced labor. Farmers cleared land, planted trees, harvested delicate crops, and prepared spices for export, yet received only a fraction of the wealth their work produced. Enslaved people, indentured laborers, dock workers, and sailors carried the heaviest burden. Voyages remained dangerous, with crews facing disease, malnutrition, storms, shipwrecks, and months of confinement at sea. In European ports, merchants and investors counted profits, while the workers who created those fortunes remained largely invisible. The flags changed, the plantations moved, and prices eventually fell. But the basic system survived. Valuable resources were extracted from distant lands and transported toward wealthy markets. The spice trade had transformed the world, but its greatest rewards flowed upward, while its greatest suffering remained far from European dinner tables. Yet the movement of spices did more than enrich empires. It transformed the way the world ate. As trade routes expanded, ingredients crossed borders and entered cuisines far from their places of origin. Black pepper became essential across Europe. Cinnamon and cloves reshaped baking, preserved foods, and ceremonial dishes. Indian spices influenced British cooking, while European demand encouraged new combinations of flavor across colonial ports. At the same time, chili peppers from the Americas traveled in the opposite direction, spreading through Portuguese and Spanish trade networks into India, China, Korea, Thailand, and Southeast Asia. Within a few generations, this foreign plant became so deeply embedded in Asian cooking that many people now assume it had always grown there. The modern kitchen was being created through migration, conquest, commerce, and cultural exchange. Every curry, stew, pastry, and spice blend carried traces of journeys that connected distant societies, sometimes through cooperation and sometimes through violence. Spices also carried another kind of power, the promise of medicine. For centuries, healers across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe used ginger, turmeric, cinnamon, cloves, and other spices in remedies for pain, digestion, infection, and inflammation. Some claims were wildly exaggerated. During outbreaks of plague, Europeans sometimes believed nutmeg or cloves could protect them from disease, despite having little understanding of how infection spread. Yet not every tradition was meaningless. Many spices contain natural compounds with antimicrobial, antioxidant, or anti-inflammatory properties, and modern research has confirmed that some can affect bacteria, digestion, and human metabolism under specific conditions. But this is where the story becomes complicated. Historical medicine mixed careful observation with superstition, commercial hype, and desperation. Spices were sold not only as flavor, but as protection against an uncertain world. Their medical reputation made them even more valuable, and gave merchants another powerful reason to control their supply. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the world of spices began to change again. Improved navigation shortened voyages. Larger ships carried heavier cargoes. Colonial plantations expanded across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, while merchants developed more reliable routes between producers and European markets. As nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, and pepper were grown in more places, their rarity slowly disappeared. Competition increased, supply rose, and prices fell. The ingredients that had once been reserved for kings, nobles, and wealthy merchants began appearing in ordinary households. Spices did not lose their importance, but they lost much of their mystery. No longer did a single island or company possess absolute control. The age of exclusive spice empires was fading. Yet the systems created to move these goods, shipping networks, plantations, warehouses, insurance, credit, and global trade routes, remained firmly in place. The luxury declined, but the machinery of empire survived. Long before modern globalization had a name, the spice trade was already building many of the systems that define capitalism today. Voyages to Asia required enormous amounts of money, far more than most individual merchants could risk alone. To solve this problem, investors pooled their capital in joint stock companies and shared both the profits and the dangers. Marine insurance protected cargoes against storms, piracy, and shipwreck. Banks extended credit across borders. Stock exchanges allowed shares in distant expeditions to be bought and sold. Warehouses, shipping schedules, contracts, and international supply chains grew more sophisticated as merchants tried to move spices faster and more reliably. These innovations did not remain limited to pepper or nutmeg. They became the financial machinery used to trade sugar, tea, coffee, cotton, tobacco, and countless other commodities. The spice trade did more than connect markets. It helped create the commercial architecture of the modern world. But the same networks that accelerated trade also helped European powers expand far beyond the original Spice Islands. Once ships, ports, armies, and financial systems were in place, merchants began moving other profitable commodities through them. Sugar, tea, coffee, cotton, and tobacco followed many of the routes first strengthened by the spice trade. Fortified trading posts became permanent colonies. Commercial agreements turned into political control. Private companies became instruments of conquest, collecting taxes, enforcing laws, and reshaping local economies to serve distant markets. Spices had opened the door, but empire soon walked through it. What began as a search for pepper and nutmeg developed into a global system that redirected wealth toward Europe and tied distant societies together under unequal conditions. The spice trade did not create colonialism by itself, but it gave European powers both the motive and the machinery to expand it on a scale the world had never seen before. As prices continued to fall, spices crossed a final boundary. They became ordinary. What had once been locked in royal storerooms and guarded by armed fleets began appearing in shops household kitchens, and eventually mass-produced foods. Industrial grinding, standardized packaging, steam-powered shipping, and later refrigeration made distribution faster and cheaper. Pepper no longer had to be displayed as a symbol of wealth. Cinnamon no longer belonged only to aristocratic tables. Nutmeg and cloves could be purchased by families who would never have seen such luxuries centuries earlier. This transformation was one of the spice trade's greatest ironies. The more available spices became, the easier it was to forget what they had once cost, not only in money, but in human lives. Convenience erased memory. By the time small glass jars appeared on supermarket shelves, the wars, plantations, and vanished communities behind them had faded almost completely from public view. Today, the spice trade is larger and more efficient than ever, but much of its old inequality remains hidden inside modern supply chains. Pepper may be grown in Vietnam or India, cinnamon harvested in Sri Lanka or Indonesia, and cloves collected by small farmers across tropical regions before passing through exporters, processors, shipping companies, and global retailers. By the time the final product reaches a supermarket, its origin has often been reduced to a small label on the back of a jar. Consumers see a clean package and a low price. They rarely see the farmers exposed to unstable markets, unpredictable weather, crop disease, or powerful buyers who can determine what their harvest is worth. The age of armed spice monopolies may be over, but control has not disappeared. It has simply become less visible, moving from colonial forts and warships into contracts, commodity markets, and global distribution networks. The complexity of modern supply chains has also created another problem: spice fraud. Once spices are ground into powders, it becomes difficult for consumers to know exactly what they are buying. Expensive products may be diluted with cheaper ingredients, artificial coloring, husks, starch, or other plant material. In some cases, contamination can occur during harvesting, storage, or transportation, especially where regulation is weak and traders are under pressure to keep prices low. This problem is not new. Merchants have adulterated valuable spices for centuries, mixing pepper with seeds or adding weight to increase profits. But modern global distribution allows a single contaminated batch to travel across multiple countries before anyone discovers it. The spice trade may no longer be controlled by cannons and fortified islands, yet the same hunger for profit still creates opportunities for deception. The packaging looks cleaner, the violence is quieter, but the struggle over value, control, and trust has never completely disappeared. Climate change is now adding a new layer of uncertainty to the history of spices. Many of the world's most important spice crops depend on narrow environmental conditions: specific temperatures, reliable rainfall, fertile soil, and carefully timed harvests. Black pepper vines can suffer from extreme heat and flooding. Cinnamon trees are vulnerable to changing rainfall patterns. Nutmeg and clove plantations can be damaged by stronger storms, drought, and the spread of plant disease. For small farmers, one failed season can erase an entire year of income. Yet consumers thousands of miles away may notice only a slight increase in the price of a jar. Once again, the true cost remains hidden at the beginning of the supply chain. Centuries ago, empires fought to control where spices could grow. Today, the greatest threat may be whether those regions can continue growing them at all. The geography of spice is changing again. This time, not through conquest, but through a warming planet. And yet spices remain far more than commodities. They carry memory, identity, and belonging. A single aroma can connect a family to a homeland thousands of miles away. Cardamom in tea, cumin in a stew, cinnamon in bread, or cloves in a holiday dish can preserve traditions long after people have crossed borders and built new lives elsewhere. Migration has carried spice blends into new cities, where recipes adapt, combine, and evolve. Foods once considered foreign become local favorites. Entire neighborhoods are shaped by restaurants, markets, and kitchens, filled with flavors from distant regions. This cultural exchange is one of the more hopeful legacies of the spice trade. The same ingredients once transported through conquest now travel through families, communities, and shared meals. Empires tried to own spices, but no empire could permanently control what people created with them. Flavor crossed every border. The legacy of the spice trade is also written into the map of the modern world. Ports that once loaded pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg grew into major commercial cities. Colonial boundaries drawn to protect trade routes later became national borders. Languages absorbed foreign words. Cuisines mixed with imported ingredients. And communities formed around the movement of sailors, merchants, soldiers, and forced laborers. Even places far from the original Spice Islands were transformed by the struggle to control them. Amsterdam became a center of global finance. Lisbon grew rich from oceanic trade. New York emerged from a colonial rivalry, partly connected to nutmeg. The effects spread far beyond the kitchen. Spices influenced where ships sailed, where forts were built, where wars began, and which cities gained power. Their physical size was tiny, but the political and economic structures built around them were enormous. Perhaps the most remarkable part of this story is how completely we have forgotten it. Spices are now so common that they seem almost invisible. Nothing about them suggests war, slavery, corporate conquest, or the collapse of island societies. Their low price hides their violent past. Modern consumers encounter only the final product, cleaned, ground, packaged, and separated from the centuries of struggle that brought it there. History has turned objects of obsession into ordinary ingredients. But that ordinariness is deceptive. Each jar represents routes once guarded by warships, plantations once worked by forced labor, and markets once powerful enough to redirect the ambitions of entire kingdoms. Remove spices from history, and the modern world would look profoundly different. Portugal might never have built its vast maritime network across Africa and Asia. Columbus might not have sailed west in search of a faster route to the markets of the East. The Dutch East India Company might never have gained the wealth and power that helped shape the modern corporation. Amsterdam's financial markets, global marine insurance, and international shipping systems would have developed along a different path. Colonial conquest would still have occurred, driven by gold, land, religion, and other commodities. But its timing and geography might have changed dramatically. Spices were not the only force that created the modern world, yet they acted as one of its earliest accelerators. They gave European kingdoms a reason to cross oceans, investors a reason to finance dangerous voyages, and corporations a reason to combine commerce with military power. Tiny ingredients became engines of global transformation. That is what makes the history of spices so unsettling. The same global system that once moved nutmeg under armed protection now delivers pepper, cinnamon, turmeric, and cloves to supermarkets within days. The ships are larger, the routes are faster, and the companies are different. But the basic question remains: who controls the trade? And who receives the profit? Most consumers pay only a few dollars, while distant farmers continue to face unstable prices, harsh working conditions, and environmental risk. The story, therefore, cannot be sealed safely inside the past. The story of spices was never simply about flavor. It was about desire, the kind of desire powerful enough to send ships into unknown oceans, turn merchants into conquerors, and transform corporations into empires. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg helped redraw maps, build global trade networks, spread cuisines across continents, and create fortunes that still echo through the modern economy. But they also left behind massacres, forced labor, broken communities, and systems of inequality that have never fully disappeared. Today, these once priceless treasures sit quietly on supermarket shelves, cheap enough to be forgotten. Yet every pinch carries the shadow of the world that fought to possess it. The next time you season a meal, remember that history is not always hidden in monuments, crowns, or battlefields. Sometimes it waits inside a small glass jar, because the tiniest ingredients can carry the heaviest past, and sometimes the smallest things leave the deepest scars.